So in most negotiations, you see that it's carrots and sticks. If the United States is not willing to hear Vladimir Putin and his demands that Ukraine not be able to join NATO ever, what actually is on the table? What actually can the United States negotiate? We keep hearing about that, we're trying to find a diplomatic solution, but it seems like everything that we're hearing in the public is that, Vladimir Putin's issue is NATO, and the United States and the EU say that that's non-negotiable. So what actually can we do to avoid, a conflict?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the reality is Vladimir Putin put forth a demand that he knew could never be met. I mean, NATO, by its own articles of incorporation, leave it up to member countries to join. And then there's a very specific process as to whether or not you can become a member of NATO. And so it's impossible to guarantee a country will never be allowed to be in NATO. Like, it's just inconsistent with the whole principle of NATO. And he knows that. And so he put that forward knowing that no one's going to agree to that. On the other hand, when he raised questions about his security, I think the Biden administration has made it very clear, and there have been an exchange of of proposals and obviously lots of diplomatic meetings, that there are ways to reassure Russian sovereignty, which is sort of a joke because NATO is not an aggressive alliance. I mean, joining NATO doesn't enable Ukraine to aggressively invade Russia. It's an absurdity, which is why the intelligence that was released by the Biden administration that Russia was actually developing a propaganda film with actors and fake dead bodies to claim that Ukraine invaded Russia and that they were retaliating by I mean, it's preposterous because no one believes that Ukraine has the capacity to do that, and being a member of NATO would not enhance that because it's a defensive posture. But having said that, there are ways to provide some security, arms treaties, other things. The reality is, I think the biggest challenge for Vladimir Putin, which is the hardest one, is the real threat to Russia and the security of this tyrant, despot, is a functioning, vibrant democracy on his border. The Russian people look at Ukraine and they think, there's a country with freedoms and democracy. Like, why can't that be us? That's the single greatest threat to Vladimir Putin. And so he doesn't want Ukraine on his border because it will provide tremendous unrest in his own country, which already has a cratering economy, big challenges. And so, he can't move Ukraine. It's on his border. So, I think there are ways to try to create some security assurances. But the real insecurity to Vladimir Putin is not a Ukraine part of NATO. It's Ukraine continuing as a functioning and prosperous and stable democracy, which is why my prediction is he's going to try to do something which he's already doing through cyber warfare, just to destabilize Ukraine, that he doesn't actually want to take it over. He doesn't want the responsibility that comes with that, and that will be a long, drawn-out, ugly street fight. But he just wants to poke enough at it to create instability so he can try to put his own person in power rather than the democratically elected president, so he can show his people that's not so great. Democracy in Ukraine is not so great, to try to, prevent sort of uprising in Russia. So I think that's the biggest threat, is Ukraine as a functioning democracy. That's a hard thing to alleviate because that's obviously what we want.
Jason, anything you want to finish on this topic? Because I want to move to another one, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Just real quick. You keep bringing up the fact that Ukraine needs to get to the point where it's a functioning democracy, but it seems like it's a long way away from that. Do you agree with the president when he said that Ukraine is possibly decades away from joining NATO?
Yeah, I didn't say Ukraine's a long way from being a functioning democracy. It's a democracy right now, and it's done great work in terms of electoral reforms, making real progress on corruption, rule of law. But look, there's a long way to go. To become a member of NATO, there's certain benchmarks you have to meet. So I think the president is absolutely right. As a practical matter, it is unlikely Ukraine is going to meet all those benchmarks for not for a very long time. That's quite different than saying, okay, Russia, we will agree to your demand that they not ever be a part of it. Like, that's not for anyone else to decide but NATO and Ukraine. But yes, it is not something that's going to happen tomorrow because they just haven't met those benchmarks.